Okay, we'll move on to the discussion section. Thank you, Dr. Turk. Oh, for display. Okay, so the only question we have today, it's only one, but it's a big one. And so we're going to start, and I'll just go in alphabetical order through the key discussants first. Our question is, how do we define circadian disruption for the purpose of informing the NTP literature-based health hazard assessments? And our first key discussant is Dr. David Blask from Tulane.
I agree that is a very big question, and the term circadian disruption really evolved and became in relatively common usage amongst circadian biologists and people interested in shift work before we really defined it per se. And I think we all had a notion of our own bias of what circadian disruption is. And actually Richard Stevens was the first to actually come up with that term. And it's a term that conjures all sorts of thoughts about what disrupting or dysregulating the circadian system really is, because there's so many complex components of the circadian system. Obviously, as Fred mentioned, the main player is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that obviously many experiments have been done over the years to show if you knock out the suprachiasmatic nucleus by lesions or what have you, bright light exposure, the circadian system becomes episodic and unsynchronized and dysrhythmic. And I think that we have to, in order to really come up with something that we can agree on, I think we have to go back to what we all can agree on, and what's the definition of a circadian rhythm, and start there. And I don't think we've in any collective group have ever gone through that exercise. And the classic definition of what's a circadian rhythm? Well, it's a rhythm that has a period, has an amplitude, has a duration, a phase, what have you, and is important for maintaining homeostasis. But I like to actually call it homeokinesis because it's a dynamical system. It's not a linear system. So, to my way of thinking, I think that any perturbation in any one of or combination of those aspects or characteristics of the rhythm could qualify as circadian disruption. I think what I've seen evolve over the last several years is I think people think of circadian disruption primarily as a shift in phase, that it's a shift in phase that's a circadian disruption, and very little short shrift has been given to changes in amplitude or even changes in duration. And I think those have to be part of the definition if you agree on the basic components of what a circadian rhythm is. And I kind of backed into circadian biology through my experiences and training with Russ Reiter in melatonin. So I come from a melatonin background, and the melatonin rhythm is, as we all know, is one aspect of the circadian system. It's one of the hands of the clock. It's one of the hormonal hands of the clock, but it's a very important one, and it's generated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And we all know the pathway, and it really does inform all the cells and tissues of the body about certainly timing of the day and particularly night length. It's the hormone of darkness, or the circadian hormone of darkness. And I think a lot of people think of circadian disruption as being something with respect to melatonin as being something apart from suppressing the melatonin amplitude. I think people think of that as a mask, what we call a masking effect. All right, doesn't really involve the oscillator per se. And I would disagree with that because there's data relatively new since at least 2009 or maybe even a little bit before, showing that the suprachiasmatic nucleus really has at least a couple parts to a couple regions to it. That a dorsal medial part and a ventral lateral part that are very, very integrated, highly integrated with one another. And Horacio de la Iglesias from University of Washington in Seattle has done some very elegant work with his group, showing under a very forced dysynchrony model in rats, where the animals are put on 11 hours of darkness, light and 11 hours of darkness. They develop this weird oscillation where their locomotor activity free runs with a period of greater than 24 hours. However, their melatonin rhythm becomes synchronized with the 22 or 11-11 light-dark cycle. And basically, without getting into all it's very complex and elegant experiments they did. But when the synchronizing information about light coming from the retina goes to the ventrolateral portion of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then communicates that entraining information to the dorsal medial nucleus, which is really the timing part of the SCN. And then, of course, the ventrolateral also goes on to be able to suppress melatonin acutely or for a long time, depending on how long you have the lights on of sufficient intensity and wavelength. But the point is that the expression, maximal suppression of the melatonin rhythm in terms of its peak amplitude is found when the dorsal medial oscillator, which is free running, is lined up with the entrained ventrolateral part of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. When they're misaligned by 180 degrees, you get maximal suppression of melatonin. So that decompression and compression waxes and wanes with the interaction of those two parts of the oscillator. So the kind of the classical definition, or different definitions of what masking is, the one I like, because I'm not that bright, so it's easier for me to understand, is that masking kind of involves effects on rhythms downstream of the central oscillator. And clearly those experiments really call into that definition into question. And to my way of thinking, because the elements, the clock elements responsible for suppression of the melatonin amplitude, which is part of a circadian rhythm, is within the oscillator. So I think we have to kind of redefine how we think about those two things. And again, my bias is melatonin. But what it does is it begs the question, what do we consider to be circadian disruption? And in my opinion, I think we need to at least have a discussion about all the parts of a circadian rhythm as being potentially manifestations can have manifestations of aspects of disruption, not just phasing, which is a critically important part of it. But I think that's a restricted definition.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Blass. Next, we have Dr. Michael Gorman from University of California at San Diego.
So what is circadian dysregulation? I think it's a very useful term, but I'm really not certain what it means. And I think we could talk a lot about that. So I want to first say what a fantastic job I think the people who put together the abstracts and the summary tables did. They organized just a phenomenal amount of really diverse work in a very useful way, and I can't wait to show my students what can be done. I mean, it's just an absolute model. And I think that the message that sort of comes from that, and also from Fred's talk, is that there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence that sleep and circadian rhythms are absolutely essential to every aspect of health. But looking at these tables, what we see is that there's also a lot of diversity, there's a lot of disagreement. There is not an absolutely tight convergence. And I don't think we need to worry too much about that, but what I think we need to do is sort of go on to the next stage. And so Fred's talk, I think, was absolutely inspirational, and I think few people have probably done as much for promoting the idea of circadian rhythm, sleep, and health as Fred has, sort of nationally. But we're left with a situation where we don't really know what's absolutely critical. And so when we talk about circadian regulation, maybe it's sort of analogous to pollution. But pollution only goes so far. We need to know, is it particulate matter? Is it lead? What are the elements in any particular context that are relevant to negative health outcomes? And I think that's where we have some difficulty. So he only touched on a few of the models that routinely get used. The chronic jet lag model is a beautiful model. Exposure to constant light, constant dark, non-entrained, entrained to non-24-hour cycles and things like this. These all show important effects in different contexts. The problem I see is that whereas circadian disruption is sort of a lumping term, is really useful in terms of getting attention, making a general point about the great importance of these things. We need to figure out specifically kind of what's going on, and there are going to be very, very different factors which are going to matter in any of these given outcomes. And I think one of the dangers is that if we talk too much about circadian disruption as a global category, we identify any change that we see when we make a change to the light and dark environment or food timing or any of these things, that we interpret the change in the system as dysregulation or disruption, and it may not be. So I would, Fred alluded to photoperiod and perhaps some of the work that Randy has done. And I think it's really important to stress right off the bat that the circadian system operates very differently in natural conditions when it's entrained to summer and to winter. And it profoundly regulates all aspects of, maybe not all, but virtually all aspects of physiology. Reproduction is different in summer and winter. Immune function is different in summer and winter. Metabolism is different in summer and winter. And the species in which you're looking at it may respond differently. So short days increases body weight in one hamster species, but decreases it in another. And so in neither case would we want to say that the circadian system is disrupted. If we look at clock gene expression, it's going to be different in these different contexts. If we look at, it's going to be a function of physiology and all sorts of things. So I think it's really, really key to not interpret a change as an indicator of circadian disruption per se. And so one kind of way of sort of breaking things down, I think, might be to talk about disruption of the environmental cycles that we're imposing as sort of one category versus disruption of the circadian system biologically. And there may not be, one may not imply the other just as a result of change. I'm also uncomfortable with the terms misalignment and dysregulation as kind of general terms. I mean, I think they have tremendous value. And so I love the example that Dr. Glass gave of the when the phase angle between two components changes, you do see a difference. We know that if we change phase angles between various things, we can get physiological differences, but again, it's not clear how important, we don't always have the same phase angles between various components, and so that's important to keep in mind. And then the last thing I'd say is that to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of variability that different species have in kind of how they organize themselves. So, for instance, food restriction or asking mice to work for food rewards will change when they phase their activity. They may become more active during the day than during the night. Voles at different seasons of the year will switch from being nocturnal to diurnal. Owl monkeys organize their activity differently as a function of moonlight. And so there is a lot of plasticity in the circadian system in terms of how things can be organized. And so when we talk about disruption, I think it's important to start being more specific. So are we talking about the alignment of feeding with the sleep-wake cycle? Are we talking about the timing of sleep with regard to the melatonin rhythm? Are we talking about an acute action of light on phase resetting? Are we talking about an acute action of light on melatonin suppression? All of these things, I think it's important to, maybe it's important to refer to circadian disruption to sort of bring us all together. But I think we need to be very, very specific, and we need to start separating out which of these factors are important in any given negative health outcome. And so one of the things that I'd really like to see is that the papers that go into new health domains, and I mean, it's wonderful to sort of see this promulgation of the recognition of circadian rhythms for various outcomes. I think it's critically important that we not just kind of look for one model that causes a perturbation, but then we try to see, well, okay, what other types in the disruption camp don't have an effect on that outcome, and then we can rule that out. So if we see the chronic jet lag model causes mortality, well, can we rule out just the effect of light by putting animals in constant light and not seeing that effect? Can we kind of slice and dice and figure out what's really important in any given case?
Thank you, Dr. Gorman. Okay, next we have Dr. Mike Smolinski from University of Texas at Austin.
Well, like everybody else, I also do not know how to define circadian disruption, but it has led me to lose several nights of sleep each week for the past several weeks. And while I have not been sleeping, I've been thinking, rightly or wrongly. I'd rather go back and draw on my experience in working in the field of shift work, either directly or indirectly since the mid-1970s, but also from my fundamental exposure to the field of chronobiology. And from that perspective, our biology is organized according to different periodicities. So in broad ranges, we have circadian domain, but then we have higher frequency rhythms that we, for better or worse, call ultradian high frequency rhythms. And then we have infradian rhythms, and those are rhythms that are much longer than 24 hours, which would include the menstrual cycle, and the ultradians could very well include and do include kind of the 90-minute cycles or so that we see very often in sleep staging. So from that perspective, instead of focusing, I'm afraid I'm making a more expansive judgment or perspective, is that one could actually talk about disruption of infradian, circadian, and ultradian, or if you will, the entire biological time structure, depending on different times of exposures and whether we're talking about males or females and different age and so forth. And then in looking at circadian disruption, which I'm not sure I like that term either, I think back to some of the earlier work that was done by Hans Selye, who was an endocrinologist, I believe, at McGill, who talked about the fact that our biology is adaptive. And part of that is when you adapt and you have a stress, very often the response to stress can be positive, but very often it leaves some injury, maladaptation, like infection, you get a wall off, and then you have some scar tissue or what have you as a result. And so getting back to what Michael was talking about, our biological time structure is part of our biological adaptability. And so part of the adaptability is the ability to actually dysregulate when required to adjust to an environmental perturbation, whatever that may be, whether it be a physical or chemical or whatever, a psychological. And so there's going to be perhaps a change in the system, which could be a change in the period from a circadian to a higher frequency domain, and we do see that in shift workers. We do see that in jet lag studies, if we measure often enough in the transient adjustment. We could see, and we do see, a change in the amplitude, if we're just talking about circadian systems. And we see changes in the level around which fluctuations occur. And some of those changes can lead to pathology, and some can be transient and be regular positive adjustments. And I think the issue here is when we talk about cancer and other health effects is what are the thresholds, what are the limits, and what is good and what is bad, and what are the individual differences. And to give an example, in looking at what we call shift work intolerance, Dr. Reinberg did a lot of studies on shift workers, and he had them do urine collections and all kinds of measurements for up to 25 to 50 days duration, 7 to 11 measurements a day with compliant individuals, and including eating habits. And so it was interesting when as Fred pointed out, when people go to the night shift, they become scavengers. They just nibble throughout the night, and they kept diaries, and they told us what they ate, and they were eating carbohydrate-rich and fatty foods, and eating continuously. And those records are available. They're published, and those papers were published in the 1940s. The other thing that was observed is that individuals who had low amplitude circadian rhythms, and primarily what we were able to measure in those days easily was body temperature, or collecting urines for measuring 17-hydroxycorticosteroids, a breakdown product from cortisol. Those individuals who had high amplitude circadian rhythms to start with generally shifted very slowly when going from day to night work, and also had more complaints on slow rotation shifts. Individuals who had low amplitude circadian rhythms shifted very quickly and found that it was easy to adjust to those shift changes. The problem was when they were followed up over time, those with the low amplitude rhythms, as they aged, the output from the SCN, as we now know, declines, and they were more likely to become intolerant to shift work. And then we went ahead and studied them chronically to get measurements around the clock, urines and other measurements. They actually were free running. They were circadian disruptive. They did not have 24-hour periods. Some had 21.3-hour rhythms in, let's say, body temperature, maybe a 28-hour rhythm in the 17-hydroxycorticosteroids. They complained of GI disorder, peptic ulcers, chronic fatigue, hypersomnia, mood disorder, and had what we would call the chronic symptoms. So I guess what I'm saying in looking at the definition of circadian disruption, part of it is a necessary adaptive phenomena. And the question is, what is the threshold beyond that which constitutes real damage, not only in terms of the circadian domain of biological changes over time, but also with regard to the menstrual cycle and fertility, and so forth, and even the quality of sleep in terms of the ultradians or high frequency. Some of them which are linked to the production of hormones that are tied to specific sleep stages. And then when finishing, I don't even know what a normal sleep-wake cycle really is. And looking at some of the literature, and unfortunately it's not robust, the question is, for our ancestors, was it really an 8-hour sleep span and a 16-hour activity span, or was it a much longer sleep span when the normal light went down, that is at dusk, and at dawn, did they wake up and spent some hours that way. And leading to that is, are we all living on a short day span at this day and age with artificial light? And what does that mean for our species? Don't know.
Thank you. Okay, we'll do, sorry, go ahead, Dr.
You know,
Torres.
since I start, do I get a last since I in the question?
You do get to be last for the key discussion.
I want to say that I'm very comfortable with circadian disruption.
Okay.
Just like I'm comfortable with using the word cancer. There are many kinds of cancer. There's many kinds of circadian disruption. So maybe that's one of the things that you want to try and do is to discuss the richness of the kinds of different disruptors and disruptions that there are. And one way to break it down sort of in a very simplistic fashion is external desynchronization. That's when our internal clock is out of synchrony with either the light-dark cycle or our lifestyle. So you see, it's where your internal is out of synchrony with an external factor. These are the old term that we used to use, external desynchronization. And obviously that occurs in shift workers. That occurs in non-24 hour, which has been described, as you know, as a circadian rhythm disorder. So there's going to be whole classes of circadian disruption or circadian dysregulation, whether it's just a transient with jet lag, whether it's sort of permanent with a shift worker, whether it's sort of permanent with a social jet lag, where again you're out of synchrony with an external factor. Then you have a whole other category of what I call internal desynchronization. And when internal desynchronization, there are certain things we can monitor now. We can monitor like melatonin and body temperature and say there's a normal phase relationship between them. And I can talk about the amplitude too, which I also think Dr. Blass says is very important, that we can begin to see when they're desynchronized from each other. But we're really in a very primitive stage of being able to look at internal desynchronization, when the pancreas is out of synchrony with the liver, for example. And I like to use the tip of the iceberg. There's a sleep disorder that's called night eating sleep disorder or night eating syndrome, where people eat, and it's not the crazy one where people don't remember getting up in the middle of the night and eating tons of ice cream and chickens and dog food. It's where people are taking in like 75% of their kilocalories in the night. And Mickey Stuckert, who was the discoverer of it and defined it in 1955 or something, he was in contact with me toward the end of his life a lot because it's not a sleep disorder. It's a circadian disorder. Your eating is out of synchrony with your sleep. And I call it the tip of the iceberg because we can see it. It's like, so if you look at an iceberg, you can see the tip. You can't see what's beneath it, but we know that 90% of the iceberg is beneath it. So what we can't see is the internal desynchronization. We will be able to see it, and I think that's something that you, as the NIH in general and the toxicology program in particular, will want to keep track of. The instrumentation now is exploding in being able to monitor and track people. So about 10 years ago, I was talking to a group of people, and I was saying it's kind of like the stealth bomber. There are thousands of instruments on that stealth bomber that are monitoring everything. There's only one thing that's not instrumented, and that's the human. But that's changing. I mean, with Fitbit and Jawbone are just the Model T of where we're going to be. Ultimately, chip under your skin, monitoring hundreds of different rhythms at once, sending it to your iPhone 12, and then that going into a cloud, and that being able to say, hey, your liver is out of synchrony with your gallbladder function. There's a guy named Michael Snyder at Stanford, who's sometimes called the measured man. He's a funny guy. I've been working with him on this NASA project. And he monitors himself daily. He's collecting his blood daily, his urine daily, his fecal material daily, and he's keeping track of all kinds of metabolites and so on. Well, eventually that's all going to be, that's okay, that's where we are now. But I think ultimately we're going to be able to have that kind of precision medicine. There are organizations like Patients Like Me, which are collecting online data from 500,000 people with a condition. And then can we be able to track those and show that, wow, you get a flare-up of your colitis when you have a desynchronization, circadian internal desynchronization. So I don't have a problem with using circadian disruption or desynchronization. It's because it's just different categories. And we just maybe need to define what those categories are, and then treat the various you wouldn't treat a shift worker the same way you might treat someone whose pancreas is out of synchrony with the muscle uptake of insulin. So I think that's okay. That's where the field is moving.
Okay, I think Dr. Thayer has a question.
I guess it's sort of an observation and question. So this reminds me a lot of, we have environmental chemicals that are referred to as endocrine disruptors. And you can imagine the conversations that have happened about trying to define what is endocrine disruption. And so I think a lot of parallels in terms of the complexity of the system. And so what we're looking for here is, we know that it's probably not achievable to define it for the field. It's really that when we have our literature-based evaluations, it's a working definition that we use in that document. And I just sort of which is really, I think, what we want to sort of end the day with, some sort of working definition. And I just want to sort of throw out an example of how endocrine disruption has been defined in these kinds of analyses, and then you can just take it for what it's worth. Obviously, the definition is different. The important point is that they've deliberately kept it at a high level. And so there's not one definition of endocrine disruption. It varies, but they're all, over the course of years, they've all tend to stay high level. So here's one from a WHO analysis. An endocrine disruptor is an exogenous substance or mixture that alters functions of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse health effects in an intact organism or its progeny or subpopulation. Huge amounts of debates among different groups about whether the word adverse belongs in there, but you can see that it's sort of deliberately kept at a high level. And so maybe in terms of the discussion, again, it's fabulous discussion, but if we can hone in on what specific phrase that we're going to call, whatever we're going to call this in the documents, that would be very helpful.
Ruth, did you have any questions or follow-up for now?
I think I'll wait. I do have a question, but I want to give I want to hear some more.
Okay, I think we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Everybody think about what Chris just charged us with. I think it's a good reminder of what we're trying to get out of this first session, and then we will move on to asking the rest of the panel this question. Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started again and start to open this up to the rest of the panel. We're putting a few notes up. The rapporteur is typing up a few of the notes to just capture a high-level view of what some of the things that have been said so far, some of the main points. I think we'll just continue with anyone on. Did you lose it? We'll go ahead and just continue around the table. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a comment. Actually, 4 of us participated in the NIEHS evaluation in 2007, where our conclusion was that shift work that involves circadian rhythm disturbance is probably carcinogenic to people. I think actually to find out, to give a title of what we evaluated was the most problematic and long-term taking question during those 8 or 9 days we were gathered together in order to find this conclusion. And at that time, I don't think that we really knew what we meant, what we meant when we made this statement, actually.
So it's my impression, but I could be wrong, that since the IARC now, there's been sort of more studies on the light at night that weren't available, and so the IARC didn't really have that piece of the puzzle to probably consider that in their definition, and we'll probably get that tomorrow. But is that true, that the knowledge that there's been more studies going in that direction, or?
Well, this has really been such an exciting 10 years since the 2007. I think Dr. Turek's talk was tremendous, and the comments have been wonderful so far, just great depth with also being understandable. But the knowledge of how the circadian system works and the control of so much of our physiology, that is new. That's certainly this since 2000 and really just taken off since the IARC evaluation.
So it is worth sort of revisiting and, for our evaluations and,
Yes.
bringing that in. So that's, I thought that was a great thing that the IARC did, but I just wanted to sort of,
Well, we weren't simpletons, but we did the. But I agree with Johnny. I mean, there's so much more sophisticated. That's why this meeting is very important. One of the reasons.
Dr. Nelson, I think, had a question.
A comment. So I think it's difficult to define circadian disruption, as we heard most of the folks over there say, but not impossible. And so I think what we don't want it to do is be some fuzzy concept that has no value, like stress or like cancer, which we named a bunch of things, cancer, before we saw there are all these differences. We're at a point where we know there's differences among the circadian disruptors, as Fred pointed out. And so maybe paraphrasing that endocrine disruptor definition and then having subtypes underneath it would be the way to approach this.
I think that's a great idea, and I like the idea of defining circadian disrupt. I think defining circadian disruptor is probably easier than circadian disruption. And to Dr. Thayer's specific point, I like I think I like in the endocrine disruptor, the adverse inclusion, I think makes a lot of sense because we know how variable circadian organization is, and so if we don't have it tied to something like that, I think it becomes incredibly vast.
Okay, we'll try to put the definition for the endocrine disruptor up there, and then we can just work from there. Dr. Vermeulen?
Just one comment to go back to the IARC evaluation, just to put it in perspective. The question at the IARC meeting was shift work. That was the starting point, and from shift work, we basically went from shift work including circadian disruption. The starting point was not circadian disruption, which would have been another discussion. Just for a clarification, just to go back to the definition, one of those persons that are not really happy with the term endocrine disruptors, really. That's another discussion. So I would like to avoid that we actually potentially use disruptor and talk more about modulation, because in the end, I mean, we're actually looking at something that modulates or changes the circadian clock. Disruption has in itself a term that would actually say that it's by definition a negative, and we don't know that for sure. I mean, probably it's not good, but I would like to talk about circadian modulation rather than actually talking about disruptor. But that's just coming also from the term endocrine disruption, which I don't particularly like.
Dr. Hall?
So I was actually going to make the same point about endocrine disruption, because I think that that's a very specific situation where we kind of know what the mechanisms are. So we know there's a receptor, we know there are things that bind to those receptors, where in this situation I think we don't know, and it's probably much broader in terms of what the specific factors are. So I would say that disruptor is not really the right word, because it implies a level of knowledge or a level of mechanism that I don't think is the same in this particular setting.
My sense from the literature is in all these wonderful papers that were included for us. How's that? Okay, sorry. So my sense is that there are clear mechanisms of circadian disruption. Reduction of the amplitude of some of the clock genes, for example, period, cryptochrome, is very common in all the different models, at least in the animal models. I don't know about the human models, but you see that as a very common thing, and you see a shift in some of the endocrine disruptors of the peak time of expression of some of the clock genes. So I think we're close to knowing the mechanism. We certainly can name some of them, but point well taken. I mean, I would be worried about calling it a modulator only from the perspective of Michael's point that things like photoperiod or seasonality will modulate the circadian rhythms normally. And so if you do that kind of definition, I think you'd have to put adverse outcome associated with it.
I have one thought, which may or may not sync with what people think, but a little bit in relation to some of the ways people were talking about adaptation and lack of adaptation and downstream effects of certain things. What about putting in the word desynchrony instead? I mean, I think because then that's not implying whether it's a good or a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you can't have adaptive things or that things may be maladaptive.
I think Dr. Figueroa had a comment too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would like to add when we think about the definition is how we're going to measure that and how we're going to characterize that both in lab studies and field studies. Because if we come up with something that we can't then define and be able to measure and see what are the disruptors, or if you change something in shift work, how do we show that you increase or decrease disruption? So I think part of the definition should include outcomes and how we're going to measure those outcomes both in lab studies and animal models, as well as in field studies and in real life applications.
Dr. Coogan?
Yeah, I'd just like to highlight the point, I think, picking up on what Dr. Turk said about social jet lag. You know, when you measure social jet lag, which Till has done in nearly 1 million people now, you get an average of about 1.5 hours social jet lag. So who doesn't have circadian disruption? You know, so, and I think it's a very important point. So what are we trying to do? You know, what's our baseline? You know, we can do that in animal studies fairly easily, but when we're looking in the population, certainly a Western population, we all probably have social jet lag and significant circadian disruption. And if you select out then the people that have minimal social jet lag, you're probably selecting in a morning type, which may have a particular genetic makeup. So, you know, it's a really tricky question, and I think the parallel with endocrine disruptors may break down somewhat, that it's, you know, that's a simpler scenario in which people are exposed or not exposed. Here, we're all probably exposed, but to what extent?
First, I want you to ask more questions. I love your accent. Secondly, there are such populations in the state that I live. We have the Amish, the old order Amish, which we are studying now. We've paired up with an ongoing metabolism study, and they do not see light at night, and they do not engage in social jet lag. And so there are populations like that you can use, you know, nearby, for us anyway, to see what the baseline is.
Yeah, I guess the issue with those is how well do they generalize given their particular genetic makeup, etc.
I like the idea of including social jet lag. I think school start times might be very well incorporated in the definition of a circadian disruptor.
Perhaps some of you who are from NIEHS can help me out. I'm thinking about a paradigm that was introduced by industrial hygiene in around the 1960s or 70s. I don't know if it was Tucker was the name, but he divided, does that ring a bell? There was divided exposures and response to exposures that were in the preventive medicine area, so that people were exposed, let's say, light at night. But if you include circadian rhythms as part of the homeostasis, that you would have a response that would not lead to injury or insult, and that there was a means of adaptation, like in exposure to heat in hot environments, So you have some physiological changes, and then you got to a threshold from an industrial hygiene perspective where you cross the barrier, and that would change male, female, age, whatever. And then you would be talking about curative medicine, because you'd have some pathology and injury. And so getting back to, I'm pretty much convinced that almost everybody in today that's exposed that aren't Amish or living somewhere on the planet without light have some degree of dysynchrony. And the question is it pathological? Is it within the bounds of the circadian system's flexibility as part of our adaptability? And is then, when we go too far, like in jet lag, in shift work or overexposure or number of years, if children are starting out with exposures to blue light in their devices at the age of 2, is there some either age and or duration or phenomena that actually leads to the maladaptation and actually injury? And for me, I'm going back to my aspects when I worked in occupational medicine, industrial hygiene. Maybe that paradigm can be useful in looking at some definitions, and because I think circadian disruption is like, if you want to look at heart rate and you go into a hot environment, your heart rate is disrupted. It goes up. You start sweating. And you go back, put on the air conditioner or go to a cooler place or cool down. It's still within the paradigm. You have some adjustment, but your homeostatic physiological system is disrupted. It's not pathologic unless you have really heart disease that's restrictive. So whether that's useful or not, I just throw it out there.
Yeah, just very quickly, yes, it's useful. I like that idea about homeostasis, and that this disruption a particular disruption doesn't mean you get a drop dead tomorrow. You may not,
right.
You may adapt to that, okay, but disruption, the reason I like that word is frankly, there's the homeostasis, the normal adaptation to our environment, extended environment, which was the sun and not electricity.
Right.
Now, some of that disruption is not going to kill you, but I can smoke a pack of cigarettes for a day. I can do it for a week and then quit, and it'll have no impact at all on my health. But if I do it every day for 20 years, it will.
Thanks. I mean, this is a good education in linguistics, for me at least, as non-native. No, I actually, because disruption for me does have a pathological connotation to it, and if that is actually, the majority here thinks that is not, and that it's basically a perturbation of the homeostasis, and that still can be within limits at least, that are not necessarily leading to adverse health outcomes, that I'm okay with the term. Just for me and potentially for others, but maybe I'm not alone, maybe I am, disruption has that connotation for me.
I think this is an important discussion, because I don't think circadian alterations that are within a homeostatic norm qualify as disruption. And that's why I would like your term, circadian modulation, to define that span of changes. When you go outside of those bounds, you're now outside of modulation, which can be which is adaptive or can be adaptive, and then you get to disruption. That's just how it works in my brain, feeble as it might be.
So I think I was kind of thinking along a lot of the lines what people were saying, and it seems that a key is to be able then to measure this, because if it is adapting, if it is dependent on endpoint, maybe what we're saying, if it is, what is going to lead to adverse health effects, and if we want to try and do any kind of intervention that you could measure something, what is the best way then to measure this disruption or modulation to the point that would predict disease where you don't have to measure disease, and is that part of it? And do we know what those kind of biomarkers are? And And so that seems like it would integrate everything that people are talking about, and I think you alluded to that, so.
The only danger maybe to that is allowing the disease outcome to be part of the definition of the term.
I just meant like a predictor of it.
Okay.
Not necessarily the disease outcome, but we don't, I think I heard that, but is that what you were saying, that you needed to keep it in?
You needed to keep circadian disruption in context with what the adverse effect was. Is that what I thought I heard you say? So is there anything that's common to different adverse effects, or is it specific?
I think the other thing that I would like to throw in the mix too, which I think it's where probably science is going to head to, is the individual differences. Because I think the circadian disruption may simply reveal frailties that we already have, right? And some people, and I agree with Richard, I mean, smoking has been linked to lung cancer, and if I smoked for many years, but I know people that have smoked all their lives and they didn't die of lung cancer. So what is it about it that, and you know, my mother never had alcohol, she never drank, and she died of liver cancer. How does that happen? We have no idea how it ended up happening. So I think that obviously you can't solve the individuals, but I think we're going to have to start looking at individual traits to see if there is something that we can. Correct. Who can adapt and who cannot.
So I think that's what Mike was saying
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah.
It might vary.
I'm a little worried that we're getting away from the internal desynchronization or we're talking about whether it's school start time, social jet lag, shift work, light at night. I'm thinking that just in the way the conversation's been going, we have to think in terms of that with aging. We get circadian dysregulation that's not being due to a disruptor. There's no disruptor unless you want to call aging disruptor. Certain disease states, of pancreatic cancer, so you bring it always back to cancer, it may well be when there's a dysregulation between various factors that are regulating prostate function, and you get a internal discoordination of cellular processes. So I just want to make sure that when we think about circadian dysregulation, that we don't only think of it about being imposed upon us by Edison, but that we remember that particularly since we're living to advanced ages now, the circadian, if you can even look at it that way, the circadian clock system said we never planned to be around for 70, 80 years in all the tissues of the body. You guys are extending this. We didn't evolve that way, right? So I just want to bring in, it's not only external, which I don't want to disparage external factors for their impact, but I just want to make sure we don't forget that certain disease states may be caused by, and of course there's always that problem, the disease state you may get disrupted rhythms in a disease state because of the disease, but what is the effect of disrupted rhythms between organs or within an organ, or between the SCN and the organs that are being synchronized by it, and that these internal dysregulators or disruptions or dysregulations, I like that term too, or internal desynchronization. It's more than just external.
Yeah, I agree with Fred. And certainly in cancer, it's becoming apparent that having a cancer and it developing to a certain stage in the carcinogenic process can disrupt the central circadian pacemaker, which then further encourages the cancer to become more aggressive, which then it becomes a positive or feed-forward loop. So I think what Fred is saying is important, and maybe we need in this discussion to start thinking of cancer like we think of autism, in the sense that there's a spectrum that involves external disturbances, internal disturbances, and some combination or gradation in between. I'm just throwing that out, but I think that's a very important point.
Is there a catch-all term, Fred, that would encompass those internal things? So I wrote down environmental, social, or ontogenetic, and stimuli that do this.
Well, I always think of it in terms of internal desynchronization, or internal synchronization. I'm sorry. I always think of it internal desynchronization, or normal internal synchronization, which changes depending upon the seasons, which then can set you up in our environment. That's perfectly normal to have changed when we were living in an environment that was not our modern environment. And we didn't live to be as long as we do now. But there could well be changes that are occurring internally on a seasonal basis, which were selective, they were adaptive, but they're no longer adaptive in the environment we live in now.
Anyone else from the panel have additional comments?
I thought with the last thought that Fred expressed. So these internal changes that were at one time adaptive no longer become adaptive, and maybe they become more susceptible or sensitive now to external factors. So now something that manifests initially as an internal desynchronization sets the individual up for further exacerbation of that by external factors such as inappropriate exposure to light or wrong meal timing.
Since it was mentioned a couple times, let me just bring up seasonality again, because basically we are all living in constant summer, right? It's 21 degrees all the time wherever we are, and constant long days. And so it maybe that's the perturbation that all these bad things are happening in the background of living constantly in long days, which we didn't adapt to do, or summer-like conditions.
If I can just give it one stab, so Mariana's point I think was excellent about how do we measure this and where do we, and so to sort of bridge the divide I think between the people working on mammals and or non-human mammals and those who are working on humans, and maybe the thing that's sort of the middle level area is that organic, ontogenetic, environmental, or social stimuli that produce changes in the SCN or sleep activity cycles, producing negative health outcomes or human performance, something along those lines.
Does anyone on the panel have a reaction? Dr. Twerry?
Not a reaction.
Okay, go ahead, a comment.
So I think one of the sources of confusion is, I think that for members of the panel and this, well-informed audience, it's not an issue. But we've talked about risk of disease. We've talked about homeostasis, normal health. And these are very different conversations, and we've kind of fluidly interchanged them. And I think that one of the barriers, or it seems to me one of the barriers is what's something I'm asked in my office all the time is, so what is the health recommendation? All right, so is the health recommendation, do we wait until there's clinically significant symptoms of disease, at which point getting a good night's sleep may not be the cure? Or are we really talking about, this decline in health, the erosion of health that occurs with a chronic exposure? And in either case, I'd invite the panel to discuss how well is the evidence that treatment intervention makes a significant improvement in outcome.
I think I'd like to go back one step before that and go back and again go back to the field of occupational medicine, industrial hygiene. How did we get to threshold limits? What were the criteria that were used to set safety limits for the workers involved in the workplace? And can we adapt that into looking at alteration of the circadian time structure and its limitations, getting proper biomarkers that can be easily followed.
So I think that's a really good, excellent example of success, right? We know that people, when they're too sleepy, they can't perform, they can't function. There are errors. I mean, it's very, it's very intuitive when those cases occur and are well documented. I think that Fred has made a great case in his presentation that we're now facing a new era. We have to have new thinking because the amount of sleep and rhythm, I'm sorry for using the word sleep, please forgive me. Rhythms.
It's part of sleep-wake is a circadian rhythm.
Okay.
It's fine.
Okay, I'm forgiven. So, but necessary to support performance, to prevent errors that lead to tragedy, may be different than the requirements necessary to preserve health. And preserving health, I think that's the public health objective. Like we shouldn't drink too much, things to excess. We should all exercise. We should eat right. Okay, but when it comes to the parameters that we're discussing here, is there, is that an area in which research is needed to show that the intervention is going to, produce the effect, the benefits that we're claiming?
Well, I was trying to get at the process by going back in the history of how did we get not thresholds for sleep, but threshold for even chemical exposures. And then how did we go to monitoring patients for their exposures and to know when it was safe, when the environment was safe, or when there was safe exposures. And so to be monitoring at both aspects. And well, I agree with you, but I'm trying to get, how would we go through the process so we would know what is good, what is bad? And again, we need the biomarkers, we need the animal models in terms of coming up with a process to come up with, what's safe and what's not safe, and in relationship to perceived negative outcomes of high importance to worker safety, or to everybody's safety in the real world. And again, I was just trying to use the industrial hygiene occupational medicine model, which, for the sake of the safety of the worker, is that, hey, what's safe? What is a safe environment? And how do we monitor it? And how do we monitor the worker to know that that person hasn't, in some ungodly circumstances, been overexposed and is at risk?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Mike, but we still have to go back, we still have to get some sort of definition here. I mean, that's really what we got to come out with. So I just wrote something down, and it's, please, I won't be offended if you shoot it down, tell me I'm full of crap, because people do that all the time. I'm used to it. But thinking about what we've talked about, maybe, and people mentioned it, I think Fred mentioned it, Mike mentioned it, circadian organization, okay? And I think that's very important. Maybe we should think about organization. So maybe we should think about circadian disruption as an internally and or externally induced disorganization of healthful circadian time structure in molecules or at the molecular level, cells, tissues, organs, and organism systems or something like that. So just to get, and maybe that's crappy, but it's on the table. But the key point for me is thinking about organization, because my influence with Bill Reshevsky, temporal organization. So I'd like to know what you think, what Fred thinks,
Well,
Michael.
I think I think circadian organization is very useful. And then when you have circadian disorganization, what are the implications of that, whether that's internal or external disorganization? So, I mean, I think, maybe we're worried a little too much about terms, but we're pretty much all saying the same thing, that if you disrupt them, whether you call it dysregulation, desynchrony, dysregulation, or circadian organization. But one of the things I always say is to an audience to say, look at yourself. You're organized spatially. You got easy. See, arm here, arm there, nose here, two sides to the nose, one mouth. Very easy. But you can't see temporal organization. I mean, we can see the night eating disorder. There you can see that you had circadian disorganization. But there's all of that's sort of below the waterline. And it's the importance of internal temporal organization is as important as external temporal organization. That's.
But the difficulty lies in it sort of presumes, I think, that we know what healthful organization is. And that, if we could work on that, maybe.
Well, I think that's where I think our animal models can inform us, because we can control things. And I mean, we use animal models all the time preclinically to develop therapies. All right, they're good enough for that. Okay, so why aren't different animal models where we can control conditions, and to the best of our ability extrapolate to us? I mean, we use all the time nocturnally active animals to base therapies, preclinical tests in us, and we're a diurnal species. So I think, yeah, the question is, what is a baseline? So do you go to an Amish population? We certainly can't go back in history, before the, Edison light bulb. So maybe that's where the animal models are useful for helping us, imperfectly though it might be, to define what's a baseline.
Dr. Ponda, and then Vermeulen.
I think there are two things emerging here, and Mike kind of alluded to it, that there can be acute disruption of sleep and circadian rhythm where the person's performance can be a public safety issue. And the best example is NHTSA and airlines imposing rules how many hours the pilot or flight attendants can work. And the question is, can we build from that standard to define what is chronic continuous circadian disruption that will affect the person's performance, so that we can apply it to, for example, assembly line or physicians and other people where their performance becomes a public safety issue. And then the long-term circadian disruption is where we are kind of tired with, whether it's 4 hours of sleep or 8 hours of extra light for 10 days or 15 days or 100 days. So if we agree on dividing this acute and chronic circadian disruption, then maybe we can come up with at least one clear definition that has been already adopted by NHTSA.
We don't have to come to consensus, and I suspect we're not going to.
If we define it as acute and chronic, in your mind, are you giving that any weight in terms of outcomes, negative or positive or neutral? I know you're referring to sleep, and sleep has obviously potentially immediate effects on performance and risk of accident. But if I disrupt my circadian system for 24 or 48 hours, like in jet lag, I may be a higher risk if I'm driving to an accident, especially but I mean, in terms of long-term or pathology, in the case of, let's say, a worker now who is doing rapid rotation, so they're working an 8-hour night shift one day or 2 days and then going back to day shift. So they're going to have acute exposure. Now, there's some disruption, but not as much as a slow rotation. So how are you thinking? I'm just trying to get some clarification. And is it a neutral way? Because I don't know what to do with acute and chronic unless chronic crosses a threshold that increases a negative outcome, whether it be reproduction for a woman, not being able to produce a live young, or cancer, or some other, or hypertension, cardiovascular risk, or premature death, as showed by the models, the animal models that Fred presented.
Yes, I didn't think about the rotating shift where the person is coming back. But if we...
Because we're dealing with shift work here as well.
Yeah.
You know.
But if we can now dissect that rotating shift and can come up with or discuss how many days interval should be given to this worker to go from one shift to another so that there is enough time for this person to adjust. That's one thing. And second is, can we recommend how this person should rotate from one shift to another? So those two are very interrelated questions. Should it be 1 day between rotating shifts, or 2 days, or 3 days?
And forward or backwards? Or?
Yeah, forward or backwards.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, again, going back to what a definition should be, and I actually like the first sentence that actually has been written up. I was just writing something myself, and then I looked to the right, and it actually looked quite similar. So because I was writing up the points, I think internal, external is coming back, and I think it's important to have both in there. That we all agree that it has something to do with disorganization, disruption, or some modulation, whatever word we would actually put to it, of the circadian clock or time structure. And again, we can choose which terms we want to use. I realize that there's discussion about what is then a adaptation, what is outside the norm, but that really, I think, does not belong in a definition, because in the end that depends if you're looking at acute effects or you're looking at chronic effects, of what disease outcome that actually may be different. And that is actually, I mean, that's a research question, and that is actually to see what actually in that perturbation leads to negative effects, either being short-term, acute, or long-term. So I think that actually can be left outside the definition, and it would be helpful to do that, I think.
So just to sort of get back to what I think is where you were trying to go with this, if one were to put on the negative consequences and add that to the end of that sentence, because I think that what we're trying to do here is to talk about what are the things that are going to take us out of a normal adaptive type of response and get to a place where it really does have adverse health outcomes. And then that allows for the studies that look at dose response, the studies that look at mechanisms, the studies, and particularly of different types of health outcomes. So it becomes a more encompassing way to look at it.
All right, I'm going to throw one very simple, maybe, I don't know. What about if we simply say, which is very simplistic, but it might be where we want to go, that it's a misalignment between your sleep-wake cycle and your circadian clock? Because, that's where you start on your presentation. I mean, you can't...
Like you said, that's too simplistic.
It is too...
Not just the sleep-wake cycle. Misalignment, I'll go with.
The
misalignment between internal...
and external.
And it could be, as somebody said, biochemical, molecular, cellular systems, behavioral level. Misalignment.
I think
that's a good word to put in.
Yeah, I think it is, because what we're really talking about, it is we're stressing the importance of having these rhythms, doing the right thing at the right time. And what disruption is they stop doing the right thing at the right time. So how do we capture that in a way? And I agree that, we have our lingo and we have our jargon, and if we want this to be public available, we got to be careful to start putting all these, jargon names that people are just not going to know what it means. I agree. And sleep-wake cycle, misalignment with circadian, it's too simplistic. But when you travel from here to China or, I went to Japan, I know what that is. I can feel it. I know that in the middle of the night I'm trying to sleep and I can't. In the middle of the day I have to be awake for a meeting and I'm not. I can't eat at the right time. I don't feel well. So I think we have to think about those. How can we translate that into something that people will understand?
Well, it's a very interesting point, because everyone can identify with not everyone, but the people who are rich can identify with jet lag.
Rich flies business class.
Everyone can identify with the understanding of shift work. I mean, that's kind of like everybody gets it. And I often start off some of my lectures by, when I try and explain to even very old people, saying, how many of you remember staying up all night for an exam? And how you got more and more tired. Then I show a slide that's really old, of 3 days of 72 hours sleep deprivation. And then at 8 o'clock in the morning, you begin to feel better, feel less tired, I mean. And everybody raises their hand. So if we can relate to what people have done, or like taking the red-eye flight, and then the next day feeling terrible the rest of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Misalignment should be in there, but I don't think that's all of it. And I'll go back to what I said in my opening remark. And I'm going to use my own bias working on melatonin and cancer, okay? So forgive me. Going back to the characteristics of a circadian rhythm, when we use light at night in a particular experimental way, okay, we don't change the phasing of the melatonin rhythm relative to what's going on in the cancer cell. But we do change the signal strength, the amplitude, and we can modulate that signal strength by changing the intensity of light, okay? So you could have internal alignment of rhythms, okay? But if the signal strength isn't there in one of the rhythms, doesn't matter if they're aligned. You have a rhythm that's trying to be aligned with a signal that's no longer there or is not as strong as before. So I think we have to take into account those kinds of things. And I don't know a simple kind of every man, every day way to describe that. But I think that's got to be part of it. It's not just misalignment.
Let me ask you a question. When you say, and I tell you, we have measured melatonin levels in shift workers, and they still have melatonin at night, but the amplitude is lower. Okay, so they're not shifted, but they have lower amplitude. Now the question is, and you said something interesting about the DMH and so on. So the question is it because chicken or the egg? If you have the lower amplitude, you have less of a signal, and that may then weaken the alignment with chronic exposure to that lower.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea that I'm getting at.
Okay.
And at least experimentally in our hands, we don't have any evidence for this in a human population. So I'm not going to try to extrapolate necessarily, but it doesn't take much of a suppression of melatonin in our experimental model. We calculate about maybe a 15%, 20% decrease in amplitude before you start to see a threshold effect on cell proliferation in a tumor, where the tumor significantly starts proliferating at a higher rate. Now, that may be a very slow rate, which over time doesn't result in the overt development of a clinically detectable cancer or even one that kills the host at some point. But in some individuals, that might just be enough. Okay? It just might, yeah. Yeah. So, and again, I'm obviously going from my own experimental bias, but it's real. We see it, and it's very, very reproducible. Whether this happens in human populations per se, we don't have exact evidence for that, but I'd guess that's probably true to some extent.
Yes, what I also think is a part of the problem in a definition is the biological difference between different persons and different animals. For instance, myself, I'm an extreme night person. Night work would probably not be a problem for me, and the same with jet lag right now. So you can't take a standard population or like the Amish or the animals, because they would also have different biological rhythms. So we need another kind of definition where you should be yourself should be the internal reference or something like that.
Can you just remind us what this definition is going to serve? It's for the literature-based assessment, or is it going to have a broader publication, or what?
It mainly just to move forward in the literature-based assessment. It's not like we're going to be publishing a definition, but just to help us understand the literature, and maybe to help, if it's possible. I mean, one of the objectives too would be to, as we talked about, trying to figure out what interventions you would take for circadian disruption. I think it's the question about measuring is, to me, important. That would take, if you could measure something, then that would account for individual differences. It would account for tolerance and I don't know. I think
Well, and it was like what Ruth said in her opening, light at night was the nomination. And then someone mentioned over here that shift work was what IARC started with, and you just start to bleed over into all these areas, and then each one becomes bigger and bigger, but we can't, we do need some way to, it is for the literature review at some point for us to put.
Well, one thing about the IARC, though, is that those studies were done because of light at night and circadian disruption. So that was the genesis of it.
Shift work is a surrogate.
Yeah, yes, an epidemiologic surrogate, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to add the importance of the amplitude. So, not to go into the long history of it, but when the circadian clock field was emerging, Pindrake defined the properties of the circadian clock, and the properties were period and phase. Any property of a rhythm, melatonin rhythm, cortisol rhythm, is amplitude. However, was that a property of the clock, had a decrease in amplitude and therefore had a decrease in rhythm, or was it something that was downstream? And because it was quite, you could speculate, was downstream, the amplitude lost its, the people in the circadian field sort of lost interest in amplitude because we didn't know if that was due to a circadian or a downstream property. But I think that's changed. I did write an article which, after Pindrake had died, in which I said I thought that he had sort of handcuffed the field with the definition, and they made me tone my, because he was my advisor, made me tone my thinking down. But I think we're talking about circadian rhythms here. We're not just talking about the central clock, and so amplitude could be just as critical as the phase relationship. If you're not producing enough insulin because you've got some circadian disorganization, it doesn't matter if it's in the right phase, but if you're not producing enough, you're in trouble.
So can I just come back? I have a question to ask. Okay, so we do have studies of shift workers. We know that shift work is a surrogate for. Those studies were designed because it was a surrogate, but we also know it's a complex exposure scenario, so it might be more. We know that there are now studies on light that aren't shift workers, and that's a concern for the general public, not just for workers, so we're interested in everybody. So do we need to have a better if we're trying to sort of synthesize this all together, these studies of light, these other studies of shift workers, and make conclusions, and there's a common element of circadian disruption and maybe other things, does having an understanding help inform that, or can we just go on? That's what I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. We can't measure something if we don't know what it is. And so this discussion is very helpful. What I meant was, we might not come to consensus is we don't have, and you just said it, Wendy just said it, yeah, but this is informing how we're all interacting and how we're going to do tomorrow.
Right, exactly.
So that,
That's all. I don't think we actually have to write in the definition in our monographs. I think we just need to.
say at the end of the day, here are some mechanism models. This is going to let us try to use, not just make separate conclusions, but try to integrate. That's the purpose. So I don't think I answered that very well the first time, but.
We can't define circadian disruption, but we know it when we see it.
We'll feel it when we see it.
Or feel it when we see it.
I think I like that, what you said about, the circadian rhythms with the amplitude and so on. And back to Dr. Hansen's point is, we've seen in the lab peak melatonin for different people, they're completely different, right? Some people have very high peaks, just natural peaks. Some people have very low peak. So I think that we have to also, again, back to the individual differences, you have to take that into account. And it may be that those that have the low amplitude, a little bit of messing will be what be the negative consequences. So we have to keep that in the back of our minds as well.
Well, I also agree amplitude is of critical importance, because when the amplitude goes to zero, you don't have a rhythm and you have disruption. On the other hand, I think we can consider that there are probably genetic differences, that people are probably high amplitude, strongly organized, biological time structures, and there are other people who are quite weak and are more susceptible to extraneous perturbations, which could be light or meal timing or what have you. And again, that's part of the individual variation. But I'm a little bit dismayed. I know the conference is about circadian disruption, but I know, Wendy, you've been given a set of things to do so you don't sleep at night, which includes the effects on women and fertility. So, are we talking, I know everything is layered, and as you say, every time we look at shift work, then that brings other things in. So are we talking about the biological disruption of the biological time structure to take into consideration women and seasons, as Randy brought out earlier, and misalignment beyond normal, whatever normal is, or do we want to say focus only on the circadian, which then leaves out women in terms of some of women's reproductive behaviors and light?
I think what we're going to have to end up doing here is taking in everything that we've heard, and Ruth and I will have to sit down and go through all of it and figure out exactly how we want to go forward with the literature reviews from there. And of course, we'll be in contact with advisors over that time, after that time period. I did want to give a little bit of time to anyone who is not sitting here in the panel. If anyone has a comment or question from the audience before we end for the day, please make sure the microphone's on and tell us who you are.
Hello? Can you hear us? Okay. Bob Gazauskas, Lights Out America. I'm a dentist today, but before I was a dentist, I was in biochemistry, and one of the rules we had in those days was if you put anything into a rat, you get everything out of a rat. And I've been doing a lot of reading, or some reading in this area, and I've been listening to some lectures here and elsewhere, and people are talking about rats. And one of the things that we had in addition to the rat rule was that you had three basic animals that had chemistries that were similar to human beings: the rhesus monkey, the guinea pig, and the armadillo. And since a lot of this work originated in Texas, there are probably a lot of armadillos down there that if you're looking for animal models, has something changed in the rat line that, because I don't follow this, I missed, or have there been laws passed that disallow the use of rhesus monkeys and guinea pigs and armadillos for chemical studies? Or didn't they mention that at your school?
I have read a number of papers using a number of species because I'm looking at the non-cancer health outcomes, and we're considering all of them that have been reported so far. Birds, primates,
But I think a
rodents.
veterinarian would tell you that they're quite different.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else from the audience have a comment or a question? Okay, Mike.
I just want to make one brief comment. I realize that I've continually introduced women in the menstrual cycle. And I don't know if anybody around the table or in the audience knows that light is a very significant effector on the menstrual cycle, and that Dewan had actually patented in 2002 the use of I think it was a 100-watt light bulb in a table lamp that can be used on days 14 and 17 of the menstrual cycle of women who have abnormally long and infertile menstrual cycles to synchronize them to 29 days. And that led also to the production of a book called Lunaception that in the 1970s was used to control or enhance fertility of women who were having problems of either not wanting to get pregnant or wanting to get pregnant in a successful way. So light does have a very significant effect, especially light at night on the menstrual cycle and perhaps on ovulation as well.
Okay, one more comment.
Audrey Fisher, Chicago Astronomical Society. First of all, you guys are my rock stars. The researchers and the scientists, you are the people that are going to save lives. You are already saving lives. What I get frustrated with, not being a researcher, why is there such a delay from the time that the researchers know what's going on to when the public and the officials put this stuff out there so that the public knows? You know, when you think about lead poisoning, there's such a delay for that example of what the researchers know and when they put things in implementation. Same thing with the tobacco industry. And, you know, I cry when I drive down a street and I see streetlights shining into kids' bedroom windows. When I know that if they just would have chosen the right light, aim it down on the ground, instead of trespassing in people's windows, it might make a significant difference. So, so what I'm hoping for tomorrow, is there something that we can do to give this a good kickstart and get the word out to the people that need it so that they can use precautionary principles?
Thank you for your comment. Okay, so we're going to adjourn here a few minutes early, and tomorrow we have a long day ahead of us, exciting day. We're going to work through the rest of the session starting at 8 a.m., and we have much less time in each session than we had today. So we were kind of spoiled today. We had a lot of time to mull this over. So we'll see you all bright and early tomorrow. Thank you.